Welcome to Part 10 of Knowledge Targeting, the documentary series from TI One Voice. This episode is called Toward Justice, a framework for recognition and remedy. For 9 parts we have described a phenomenon. Now we turn from description to prescription and ask a harder question. What would actually have to change in law, in evidence, and in institutions before organized stalking could be reported, investigated, and answered like any other crime? Eleanor White wrote that sentence as a demand, not a hope. Notice what she is not asking for. She is not calling for a new crime, a new agency, or a new technology of proof. She is asking that laws already on the books, passed across the early 1990s, be applied to groups rather than only to lone pursuers. That modest-sounding request is the argument this whole chapter patiently builds out, piece by piece. Knowledge Targeting is a 50-part series produced by TI One Voice. Each part works through a chapter of documented material, read against a knowledge base of court records, declassified programs, academic papers, and thousands of first-hand accounts submitted by people who describe themselves as targeted individuals. The series has one governing habit. It separates what can be documented from what is claimed, and it says out loud which one you are hearing. Part 9, The Historical Roots, from COINTELPRO to contemporary organized stalking, traced the lineage back to the FBI's counterintelligence program. Part 10 closes that first arc, the 10 episodes that define the phenomenon, by asking what remedy would look like. Part 11, The Bioelectric Weapon, Satellite-Based Mind Control Systems, opens a new section on the technology of targeting. 40 episodes still follow. This is a hinge in the series, not an ending. Everything referenced in this episode sits on the TI One Voice platform at one.witisk.org. It holds an evidence library where targets upload documents, photographs, and recordings with timestamps, a knowledge base of researched articles behind every claim you will hear, and a community wall where people compare notes. Membership is free. Nothing on it is a substitute for a lawyer, and nothing on it promises anyone a legal outcome. TI One Voice also runs TI TV, a 24-hour live stream carrying testimony, interviews, archive footage, and these documentary episodes. You will find it at meet.witisk.org, under Public, TI TV. Every part of this series also has a written companion article on the platform, with the citations laid out so you can check them yourself rather than take a narrator's word for anything. The stream runs continuously, and the article is updated over time. Here is how this episode was assembled, because method matters when a subject is contested. The spine is the chapter itself. Around it, a retrieval system searches the TI One Voice knowledge base for passages that corroborate, complicate, or contradict what the chapter says. Anything retrieved is checked against its source before it reaches the script. Where the knowledge base is thin, the narration says so instead of filling the gap. 3 rules govern everything that follows. First, documented fact and contested claim are labeled as such in the same sentence where possible. Second, no private individual is ever named as a perpetrator, because no court has found one. Third, nothing here is legal advice, and no viewer should hear a promise about their own case. Where the evidence runs out, you will be told plainly that it has run out and why. A word to anyone watching who believes this is happening to them. This chapter is about institutions, not about you. It will not tell you what is or is not happening in your life, and it cannot tell you whether any complaint you make will succeed. What it can do is name precisely the barriers that stand between a report and an investigation. Naming a barrier is not clearing it, but nothing clears without it. The episode ahead runs in stages. It opens with the due process void and the evidentiary double standard, the 2 structural barriers named in this segment. Later segments turn to the laws that already exist, to police training and intake, to aggregation, to civil remedies, to international human rights obligations, and to the newest neurorights statutes. It ends where honesty requires, with what remains contested and unfinished. None of it is a promise that any of it will happen. Section 1 of this chapter makes a claim that sounds rhetorical and is not. It says that organized stalking targets face a due process void unparalleled in any recognized category of crime. That is not a figure of speech about how unfairness feels. It is an accounting of which stages of legal process are present and which are absent. Whatever else about this subject is disputed, the shape of that absence is not. Every functioning justice system gives a person facing consequence for minimum protections. They are told what they are accused of. They are permitted to confront an accuser. They receive a hearing before the consequence lands. And they may appeal an adverse decision. White calls these the floor beneath which no civilized system operates. They are not technicalities. They are what separates a legal penalty from a simple, unaccountable act of force. Set the two sequences side by side. An ordinary criminal case runs from accusation to charge, to hearing, to verdict, to a sentence with a defined length, to a right of appeal. The sequence targets describe collapses to a single-stage selection, followed directly by something open-ended. No charge gives the conduct a name or a scope. No verdict was entered, so the idea of appeal does not even apply. There is nothing to appeal from. Take each absence in turn. There is no named accuser because the harassment is distributed across a diffuse group whose members can each say, truthfully, that they personally did nothing illegal. There are no formal charges, because no institution has agreed the conduct is chargeable. There is no hearing because the harassment simply starts, often escalating for years before a target understands what is happening, and no mechanism can declare it finished. That sentence is remarkable for what it does not say. It speculates about nobody. It claims no technology and asserts no conspiracy. It simply describes a structural absence, the missing stages that every other person facing consequence receives as a matter of course. Whatever remains contested about this subject, and much of it is contested, the observation that targets describe punishment without any process at all is a description, not a theory. So what would recognition actually change? 3 concrete things. A police report that survives intake instead of being closed as unfounded. A prosecutor able to charge a group under existing conspiracy and harassment law, rather than treating each act separately. And a category in the crime statistics so the scale becomes measurable. None of that exists today. No jurisdiction anywhere currently recognizes organized stalking as a distinct criminal offense in its own right. Section 2 of the chapter turns from process to evidence, and to a second barrier that White considers among the most consequential. Targets, she argues, are held to a standard of proof that no other complainant faces. This is not written into any statute. No law says an organized stalking claim needs more evidence than a burglary claim. The double standard operates in practice, in how complaints are actually received at the front desk. Compare the burden. A burglary victim does not have to prove a coordinated, multi-year conspiracy for a broken window to be taken seriously. One incident report opens a case. A fraud victim does not have to map an entire financial scheme. A credible account of one transaction starts an investigation. An organized stalking complainant, by contrast, is asked to demonstrate the whole pattern before any single incident counts as more than noise. The demand is not unreasonable on its face. An official receiving an extraordinary claim is entitled to scrutiny. The problem is that the demand meets the crime's design and closes into a loop. The pattern is built from individually deniable acts, so each one alone looks trivial. Prove the pattern first, targets are told. But the pattern cannot be proven unless single incidents are investigated. The demand is structurally impossible to satisfy. The consequence is that targets become their own investigators. No police department maintains an intake process for a pattern this diffuse, so the only person assembling a file is the one living inside it. Years of logs, dates, vehicle descriptions, overheard phrases, compiled without training, without chain of custody, without any partner checking the work. In the next segment we follow what that burden does to the archive and to the archivist. So the higher bar is not written in any statute. It is a reflex, and reflexes can be retrained. That is where Eleanor White turns next, from naming the problem to drafting the fix. Her proposal occupies barely 3 sentences of her book. It asks for no new court, no new agency, no new theory of crime. It asks legislators to add a few words to laws that already exist, and have existed for decades. Here is the proposal in her own words. It is time, she writes, for the anti-stalking laws of the early 1990s to finally be applied to organized stalking groups, and legislators should facilitate this by adding specific references to organized stalking and related tactics into the stalking laws. That is the whole ask. Notice what it does not contain. No claim about who is responsible. No technology. No conspiracy. Only a drafting instruction. Anti-stalking statutes already exist across the United States and comparable jurisdictions. They were passed in a wave beginning around 1990, precisely because lawmakers accepted that a pattern of conduct could be a real crime even when no single incident inside it broke any law. That is the exact legal architecture organized stalking needs. So the ask is narrow. Amend the statutes you already have so that they name coordinated groups as well as lone actors. White gives 4 reasons for leaning on the existing stalking statutes rather than proposing a new category of law. Each one is worth taking slowly, because together they explain why this particular reform is small on paper and large in effect. Pattern over incident, deniability neutral design, institutional machinery already built, and political viability, which is the reason lawyers tend to overlook and legislators never do. We will take each of them in order. Reason 1. Stalking law already evaluates conduct as a pattern rather than as isolated incidents. 1 unwanted phone call is not a crime. 2 calls may not be. A persistent, unwanted, frightening run of calls is the offense. That is precisely the evidentiary shape organized stalking takes, and precisely what ordinary criminal statutes, built around single acts, cannot hold. Extending pattern reasoning from one pair of hands to many is a small conceptual step. Reason 2. Stalking statutes were built from the start to capture harm where no single component act is itself a crime. A car driving past a house is lawful. A stranger standing in a public place is lawful. A call placed and hung up is a nuisance at worst. These become stalking only in aggregate, when their cumulative effect is to terrorize. That is the deniability structure this book has documented since Chapter 2. Reason 3. Using statutes that already exist means no new court, no new procedural apparatus. A prosecutor trained to build a pattern-based stalking case would apply that training to a coordinated group instead of one individual. Police protocols would extend to multi-perpetrator reports. Victim services would add a line to an intake form. A TI-1 voice study in the knowledge base names 3 pillars of recognition: law enforcement, legislatures, and the medical and scientific community. Reason 4 is the unglamorous one. Legislatures are institutionally reluctant to create entirely new categories of crime, because a new category demands new jurisprudence, new training, new funding, and a constituency willing to fight for it. Amendments to existing statutes are routine business. They need smaller majorities, less committee time, fewer organized opponents. White's strategy is pragmatically shrewd as well as legally sound. It lowers the political cost without lowering the protection. The history of anti-stalking law itself supports the strategy. California passed the first such statute in 1990, prompted by cases including the killing of the actress Rebecca Schaeffer the previous year by a fan who had followed her for 3 years while existing law could reach none of it. Nearly every other state followed. Congress added a Federal Interstate Stalking Act in 1996. Britain passed its Protection from Harassment Act in 1997. Look at what those 4 dates have in common. In every case, a specific gap in protection became impossible to keep ignoring. Advocacy built the political will to close it, and a new form of pattern-based criminal law came into being. American law did not invent stalking statutes in the abstract ahead of need. It built them only after particular people had demonstrated that existing law could not reach what was being done to them. The knowledge base entry on Britain's Protection from Harassment Act shows the same motion twice. By the late 2000s, campaigners argued the act was not reaching stalking. In 2012, Parliament amended it to add specific stalking offenses. The motion is still happening. Colorado and California both amended existing privacy statutes in 2024 to cover neural data, rather than writing new law. Amendment is how legislatures actually move. It is what White asks for. A reader who knows stalking law might reasonably object at this point. If pattern-based statutes already exist in every state, why can they not simply be used? Why does anything need adding at all? The answer is the most important technical passage in this chapter, and it explains both the drafting problem and the institutional failure behind it. Existing stalking law does not fail organized stalking by accident. It fails it by design assumption. In virtually every jurisdiction that has stalking law, the statute was drafted with a single obsessed individual in mind. The paradigm case is a former partner, a rejected suitor, a fan fixated on a public figure. One person, known or identifiable, whose conduct follows a target and whose intent is to cause fear. The language reflects that picture. It speaks of a person who engages in a course of conduct. Singular throughout. Now set that model against what targets describe, and watch it break at 4 points at once. Not one actor but many. Not a traceable course of conduct but a scatter of trivial contributions. Not a motive a court could name but, as White puts it, no reason ever given. And no single person against whom a restraining order could be sought, because no single person's conduct, viewed alone, meets the statutory bar. The obvious fallback is conspiracy law, and it fails for a specific reason. A conspiracy charge requires proving an agreement between co-conspirators. Targets describe participants who may never have met, recruited separately, told different stories. Where a lone stalker leaves obsessive letters and voicemails, distributed coordination can run through forums, informal social networks, and institutional channels that leave no single traceable communication. Here the evidence, as things stand, genuinely runs out. The book puts the mismatch in one image. Applying existing stalking law here is like trying to prosecute a corporation for fraud with a statute written for individual pickpockets. The harm is real. The conduct is patterned. The law's underlying purpose plainly applies. But the machinery, built for one perpetrator and one course of conduct from that perpetrator, cannot hold a case distributed across many hands, where the coordination is visible only in aggregate. It matters to be exact about where things actually stand. As of this recording, no jurisdiction anywhere recognizes organized stalking as a distinct criminal offense. Not one state, not one country. Bills have been drafted and petitions filed. A handful of local resolutions have passed. None of that has produced a statute a prosecutor can charge under. Recognition is contested, and honesty about that is worth more to you than encouragement. It helps to be concrete about what recognition would actually change. A complaint that survives the front desk instead of dying there. Incidents aggregated into one file rather than logged as unrelated notes. A prosecutor with statutory language for charging a coordinated group. A training module that teaches officers the pattern. A category in the national crime statistics so that the phenomenon can finally be counted, and therefore argued about with numbers. And it is just as important to be honest about what recognition would not do. It would not start an investigation automatically. It would not guarantee anyone believes a particular account. It would not fund a lawyer. The knowledge base notes that personal incident logs currently carry no recognized evidentiary weight in court, however carefully kept. Nothing here is legal advice, and nothing here predicts the outcome of any particular case. So the case for the small amendment is made. But White does not stop at borrowing the 1990 statutes wholesale. She argues that any extension must explicitly address 4 features that make organized stalking a distinct legal animal within stalking law, or the reform will be symbolic rather than effective. Group nature, an electronic harassment layer, international networking, and a 4th we will come to. Those 4 features are where we go next. So the gap is named. But naming a gap and drafting a law that closes it are different crafts. White does not stop at borrowing the early 90s statutes wholesale. She argues that organized stalking is a genuinely distinct legal animal within stalking law, and that 4 features make it so. Any statute extending existing law must address them explicitly. Otherwise, the extension is symbolic, a sentence added, and nothing changed on the ground. Consider what a symbolic amendment would look like. A legislature inserts the words organized stalking into its code, holds a press conference, and moves on. An officer still takes a report about 1 car, 1 neighbor, 1 strange remark. The report still goes nowhere because nothing tells that officer how to gather the incidents into a pattern, or who to charge when the pattern belongs to nobody in particular. Effective drafting has to answer those questions. The first feature is the one everything else rests on. White calls it group nature. Most existing stalking law assumes a single perpetrator, and that assumption runs deeper than the wording. It is in the statutory language, in the enforcement mechanisms, and in the training materials officers are given. All 3 presuppose a lone actor whose conduct can be traced back to that actor specifically. Organized stalking replaces the lone actor with a network. A network, in White's description, means a substantial number of participants, often strangers both to one another and to the target. Each contributes a small piece, and each piece is individually deniable. That structure is not incidental. It is what lets the whole thing operate in plain sight, and it breaks the machinery of stalking law at 3 separate points. How evidence is gathered, how liability is assigned, and what remedy a court can actually grant. Take evidence first. In a single actor case, evidence of the actor's conduct is sufficient. You show what one person did and you are finished. In a group case you must show something further, that the separate acts are coordinated, that they are not coincidence. That is an extra evidentiary burden, carried by the person least equipped to carry it. The pattern must be proved before the conduct becomes a case at all. White names 3 kinds of proof that could carry that burden: pattern evidence, statistical analysis, and testimony about common methods. The knowledge base describes exactly this being attempted through structured attack logs, standardized interview templates, and an evidence quality score weighing corroboration and timing. Those logs currently have no recognized evidentiary value in court, but they are the raw material from which a statutory standard of coordination could one day be built. The second break is liability. In a single actor case, the individual bears the whole of it. In a group case, each participant may bear only the weight of their own small contribution. A drive past, a remark, a repeated noise. Reaching the person who directs the pattern means establishing a chain of command, and that is a far harder evidentiary task than proving any one act on the street. Without it, the network survives every prosecution. The third break is remedy. A restraining order is written against one named person. Where that person's contribution is a small fraction of the total, the order removes a fraction and leaves the rest running. White's conclusion is blunt. An effective remedy has to be capable of disrupting the coordination itself, not just one participant. No jurisdiction currently offers such an order for this, and that absence is part of what the reform is meant to fix. So what would recognizing group nature actually change? At minimum, two things. The definition of stalking would explicitly cover conduct by multiple actors acting in coordination. And the evidentiary standard for establishing that coordination would be written into the statute, rather than left to judicial improvisation. In practice, that means a police report that survives intake, a prosecutor able to charge a group, and a category that finally appears in the crime statistics. Feature B is the one that makes lawyers uncomfortable, and White addresses it head-on. Across hundreds of organized stalking accounts, targets consistently report effects that go beyond the interpersonal. Heat, pressure, vibration, clicks, tones, buzzing, in some cases perceived voices, and physical symptoms including fatigue, confusion, and muscular effects. Whatever is producing these sensations, the reporting itself is remarkably consistent. That consistency is the fact a statute has to handle. Here it is worth being precise about what is and is not established. The mechanism producing these effects is contested. Chapters 11 through 13 of this book examine the technology claims directly, and we do not settle them here. The knowledge base entry on electronic harassment says plainly that there is no definitive evidence either confirming or disproving it. What is not contested is that large numbers of people report the same sensations. White's move is a legal one, not a scientific one. A framework can take the experience seriously without first resolving the physics. This is not a novel problem. Environmental illness litigation routinely involves plaintiffs whose symptoms have a contested mechanism but a consistency across cases sufficient for a court to treat the testimony as evidence. The court is not endorsing a cause. It is weighing a pattern of testimony. That distinction is the whole of it. So the statute does not need to resolve the technology question. It needs to specify two narrow things. First, that testimony about electronic effects is admissible for the purpose of establishing the pattern, like testimony about any other dimension of the harassment. Second, that the absence of an independently confirmed mechanism does not, by itself, make the testimony unreliable. That is a rule of evidence, not a finding of fact. And that difference matters. This is the most contested of the four features, and the objection deserves stating fairly. Critics argue that admitting testimony about an unproven mechanism invites unfalsifiable claims into a courtroom. It is a serious objection. The answer White's framing offers is narrow. The statute resolves nothing about mechanism, and a court weighing such testimony is not certifying that any particular technology exists. Whether that answer would satisfy a legislature is genuinely unknown. There is a nearby body of law moving faster than stalking law. Chile amended its constitution in 2021 to protect mental integrity and brain data. Its Supreme Court applied that protection in 2023. Colorado and California both amended their privacy statutes in 2024 to treat neural data as sensitive. In 2025, member states adopted a UNESCO recommendation on neurotechnology ethics, a standard, not binding law. None of it names organized stalking. Feature C is international networking, and it begins with an observation from Chapter 9. White and other targets report that the harassment persists without interruption when a target relocates, including across a national border. Relocation is the ordinary escape valve for almost every other kind of interpersonal threat. You move, it stops. Targets report that here it simply does not function. That single observation carries a surprising amount of evidentiary weight. Think about what that does evidentially. A coincidental local grudge cannot plausibly follow someone across a national border. A resentful neighbor does not have the reach. So continuity after relocation points away from the aggrieved neighbor explanation and towards something networked. That is an inference drawn from reported experience, not a proven fact, and it should be held exactly as such. But it is the strongest single argument in White's case for organization. International networking is the feature that most exceeds what any one country's domestic law can reach. A state can recognize organized stalking inside its own borders and still have no mechanism to investigate coordination originating outside them, no power to subpoena records held abroad, and no way to hold foreign participants to account. That is not a drafting problem a national parliament can solve alone. It is a treaty problem, and treaties take decades. So White's proposal deliberately narrows. Focus on the achievable first step. Extend domestic anti-stalking law so the category exists and can be built upon. Full remedy may eventually need the cross-border machinery that other transnational crimes already rely on, including mutual legal assistance treaties, Interpol channels, and specialized agreements. The knowledge base notes that even sharing case data across jurisdictions required a dedicated framework of technical standards, governance, and training before anything could move. 3 features down, and none of them is a promise. No jurisdiction anywhere currently recognizes organized stalking as a distinct offense, and the declaration guide on the TI One Voice platform is honest about its own limits. It does not start an investigation, and it does not guarantee belief. Realistic hope is the stronger kind. But there is a fourth question a legislature always asks first. How many people? That is where the argument goes next. Group nature, electronic effects, international reach, and systematic denial, those 4 features describe the animal. But describing an animal is not the same as persuading a parliament. Legislatures do not amend criminal codes for curiosities. They amend them for problems with weight measured in people. So White turns from description to arithmetic, and she builds her scale argument entirely out of the government's own published numbers, not out of advocacy material. Consider how a criminal statute actually gets amended. A committee has limited time and a queue of competing demands. A problem affecting a few dozen people rarely survives that queue. Hundreds of thousands does because a legislator can defend the spending. The knowledge base puts it another way. Individual testimonies, dismissed one at a time, can acquire evidentiary weight once aggregated and structured. Scale is not proof. Scale is admission to the room. The first figure comes from the United States Department of Justice Stalking Victimization Report published in January 2009. 11% of stalking victims said they had been stalked for 5 years or more. Duration matters here because a single obsessed individual rarely sustains a campaign that long. Circumstances change. Police become involved. Interest fades. 5 years and counting points either to extraordinary persistence or to more than one person. The second figure is sharper. 13.1% of victims in that same Department of Justice report named 3 or more stalkers. Paradigmatic stalking involves one identifiable person, occasionally with an accomplice. 3 or more is structurally different. It exceeds what a lone fixated individual can plausibly recruit and sustain, and it is the point at which a case stops resembling the scenario the 1990 statutes were drafted to address. Set the 3 figures side by side and the shape of the argument appears. 11% report 5 years or more. 13.1% name 3 or more stalkers. 6.5% knew several people were involved but could not count them. None of these measures organized stalking. Each is a proxy, a shadow the phenomenon would cast inside a general crime survey. Proxies are useful. They are not evidence of any particular case. That third group is easy to overlook and hard to explain away. 6.5% of victims could not say how many were involved. They were certain of the plurality and uncertain of the count. White adds them to the 13.1% who named 3 or more, and reaches 19.6%. Roughly 1 stalking case in 5 carrying a plausible signature of multiple coordinated participants. Apply that share to the population the same report describes, Approximately 3.4 million Americans stalked in a single year. 19.6% of 3.4 million is closer to 660,000 than to 500,000. White states her estimate conservatively at roughly 500,000. Be clear about what that is, a derived estimate from government survey data, not a count of confirmed cases. Which way is the estimate wrong? Honestly, we do not know. Household surveys are widely thought to undercount stalking because many victims never define what is happening to them as a crime. That pushes the number up. Against that, some long-running cases involve one determined person, and some victims face several unconnected stalkers at once. That pushes it down. The direction of error is genuinely uncertain, and White says so plainly rather than defending a headline. The knowledge base makes the same point structurally. TI One Voice's addendum, Milestone 0, argues recognition must come before justice, and splits it three ways: law enforcement, legislatures, and medicine and science. The projections are modeling assumptions, not forecasts. And the knowledge base is blunt elsewhere that personal incident logs currently carry no recognized evidentiary value in court. Recognition is what would change that, not the logs themselves. That is a hard sentence and an accurate one. Scale gets a bill a hearing. It does not draft it. And here White's argument becomes unexpectedly modest, because most of the law she needs already exists. The knowledge base points to Socialist Workers' Party versus Attorney General, where a long-running covert disruption program was successfully challenged in an American court. Existing law reached it. What is missing for organized stalking is not invention. It is assembly under one heading with the phenomenon named. White inventories 8 bodies of law that already exist and already work. None was written with organized stalking in mind. Each, though, contains one principle the proposal needs: cross-border reach, pattern-based evaluation, group liability, motive as an aggravating factor, technological extension. Laid side by side, they read less like a wish list and more like a parts bin. The reformer's job is selection and assembly, not invention from nothing. That is a smaller ask than it sounds. Start with the Violence Against Women Act of 1994. It did two things that matter here. It established that stalking becomes a federal concern once it crosses state lines, and it created funding streams that pushed money and training into state and local anti-stalking programs. That model, a federal frame supporting and standardizing state enforcement, maps directly onto a form of harassment that targets say follows them between jurisdictions. The state-level wave is the more encouraging precedent. California passed the first anti-stalking law in 1990, after a series of highly publicized killings. Within about 3 years, every state had one. That is remarkably fast for criminal law, and it shows two things: that legislatures can recognize pattern-based harm without rebuilding the criminal code, and that reform can proceed jurisdiction by jurisdiction rather than waiting for one comprehensive federal answer. Cross the Atlantic and the structure gets closer still. The United Kingdom's Protection from Harassment Act, passed in 1997, criminalizes a course of conduct amounting to harassment. No single act inside that course has to be a crime on its own. The cumulative effect is the offense. Section 4 covers conduct that puts a person in fear of violence. The act has been litigated for over 25 years. That durability is the point. Hate crime sentencing enhancements make a subtler contribution. They exist in most American states and many other jurisdictions, and they establish that the context of an offense, whether it was motivated by bias against a protected characteristic, can be recognized at sentencing without creating a separate freestanding crime. Applied here, the principle is simply this: law can already treat group-based targeting as a distinct dimension of an offense, not a separate legal universe. Conspiracy law looks, at first, like the obvious answer. An agreement between 2 or more people to commit a crime is itself a crime, in every common law jurisdiction. The obstacle is proof. Conspiracy requires evidence of the agreement, intercepted communications, a cooperating witness, a document. A distributed, deniable structure is precisely what defeats that. Extending stalking law to recognize group conduct would supplement conspiracy law, offering a route that does not require proving the meeting of minds. 2 European systems went further and named group harassment directly. Sweden's work environment rules treat workplace mobbing as an organizational failure, placing a duty on the employer to prevent it rather than leaving it as a private quarrel. France's law on moral harassment, adopted in 2002, criminalizes sustained psychological harassment at work. Both establish the principle organized stalking needs most, that many people acting in concert is a recognizable legal category. 2 more precedents closed the inventory. Cyberstalking provisions showed that stalking law can be stretched into a new technological domain without a new legal framework, a procedural analogy for extending it from one actor to many. And Section 76 of the United Kingdom's Serious Crime Act, 2015, created an offense of controlling or coercive behavior defined as a pattern over time within an intimate or family relationship. It has been charged, tried, and upheld. One area is genuinely new. Chile amended its constitution in 2021 to protect mental integrity. Colorado and California extended consumer privacy law to neural data in 2024. The United Nations agency UNESCO adopted an ethics recommendation on neurotechnology in 2025, which is not binding. Alongside them, the knowledge base cites the European Charter's article on the integrity of the person. None of this names organized stalking. These are building materials, not a remedy. The honest position is this. No jurisdiction anywhere currently recognizes organized stalking as a distinct offense. TI1 Voice's own declaration says plainly that it does not start an investigation, does not guarantee anyone will believe you, and is not legal advice. That candor is a strength. The principles a statute would need already exist, scattered across a dozen statute books. Next, what other countries have actually built and how close they come. So the American statutes give a reformer part of the furniture. They are not the only furniture available. White's framework grew out of United States law, but the harm it describes is not peculiarly American, and neither are the legal ideas it needs. For jurisdictions outside the United States have each built something structurally close to one piece of what organized stalking would require. None of them names it. Every one proves the principle can be enacted. Begin in the United Kingdom. The Protection from Harassment Act of 1997 does not ask whether any single act was a crime. It asks whether a course of conduct, meaning conduct on at least 2 occasions, amounted to harassment that the person knew or ought to have known was harassment. 2 knocks at a door are lawful. 200 at chosen hours by chosen people become the offense itself, and the pattern is what gets charged. That one sentence is the architecture. It does not ask what happened on Tuesday. It asks what has been happening. The act also runs on 2 tracks at once, criminal prosecution and a civil claim, with injunctions available and breach of an injunction an offense in itself. For a target whose file is 100 small incidents, none of them chargeable alone, that dual structure matters more than any other provision in the statute. Consider what that changes at a police counter. Under the first test, an officer asks whether the act reported today is a crime. A car idling outside a house is not, so the report closes. Under the second, the officer asks whether a course of conduct exists, and that same trivial act becomes one data point in a chargeable pattern. The incidents are identical. Only the question has changed, and with it the outcome. British law then did something unusual. It learned. In 2012, Parliament amended the Act to insert a specific stalking offence for England and Wales, distinct from general harassment, because 15 years of enforcement had shown that stalking behaves differently and needed its own name. That is the precedent worth carrying forward. A pattern-based statute proved workable, and when understanding of the harm improved, the law was widened to match it. Sweden approached a related problem from another direction entirely. Its Work Environment Act, and the ordinance issued under it in 1993, is widely described as the first national regulation anywhere against what Swedish law calls victimization at work. Enforcement sits not with the police but with the Swedish Work Environment Authority, an inspectorate. The duty it creates falls on the employer, and the conduct it names is group conduct, not a private quarrel. Carry that framing across. Mobbing is treated as an organizational pathology, a failure of the environment rather than a clash of personalities, and somebody carries a duty to prevent it. Organized stalking runs on small, deniable contributions from many people inside neighborhoods, workplaces, and institutions that presently owe targets nothing at all. Nobody is responsible for the setting in which the pattern operates. That is an analogy being proposed, not existing law. France reached further into the criminal code. Its law of January 2002 wrote moral harassment into both labor law and penal law, making sustained psychological harassment at work a criminal offense. Degradation of working conditions, social exclusion, and reputational destruction can amount to a crime with no violence anywhere in the file. It followed the work of the French psychiatrist Marie-France Hirigoyen, who made that harm legible to a general readership. Canada supplies the fourth piece. Section 264 of its criminal code, enacted in 1993, makes criminal harassment an offense, covering repeatedly following a person, watching their home or workplace, and threatening conduct directed at the person or any member of their family. That extension to the family matters because targets consistently report that a campaign is rarely confined to the person named in it, and rarely stops at their front door. The Canadian test is what makes it useful here. The conduct must be such that the complainant reasonably fears for their safety, judged in all the circumstances they actually face rather than against some untroubled bystander. That clause does enormous work. It is the difference between asking whether a stranger walking past a house is frightening in the abstract, and asking whether it is frightening on the 40th consecutive evening. So here is the inventory. For jurisdictions, for principles, conduct judged as a pattern, group harassment named as a category, a duty placed on the enabling environment, and a reasonableness test that admits the complainant's real circumstances. Not one of them is novel, and each has been drafted, litigated, and refined for decades. What no jurisdiction has yet done is assemble them under a single heading, and apply that heading to this conduct. One newer strand deserves accuracy rather than enthusiasm. Chile amended its constitution in 2021 to protect brain activity and the data derived from it, the first country anywhere to do so. Colorado and California each amended privacy statutes in 2024 to treat neural data as sensitive personal information. Those are enacted laws. Almost everything else in neurorights remains a proposal or non-binding guidance, and none of it creates an organized stalking offense. State the position honestly. No jurisdiction on earth recognizes organized stalking as a distinct offense, and recognition itself is contested. The counterweight, drawn from the knowledge base, is the due diligence doctrine in international human rights law. A state's obligations do not stop where private actors begin. Whether any government would accept that the doctrine reaches this conduct has never been tested. That is a gap in the record, not a promise. Which brings us to the shape of the argument itself. This chapter's proposal is only as strong as the 9 chapters standing behind it, and the order of those chapters is not decorative. It is load-bearing. Any serious case for legal reform is built the same way. Definition first, evidence next, mechanism last, and only then the ask. Reverse that order and the proposal collapses under the first hostile question in committee. Each stage answers one question a lawmaker actually asks, in the order they ask it. What exactly is this thing? How many people does it affect? Why has nothing been done about it already? And only then, What do you want me to do? Put the ask first, and it sounds like a moral appeal from somebody who is upset. Put it fourth, and it sounds like a case a committee could work on. Definition first, because you cannot legislate a category nobody can state. Chapter 1 supplied it. A substantial number of coordinated stalkers, unknown to the target beforehand, tightly networked across jurisdictions, applying a customized menu of tactics across most of daily life. Chapter 2 dissected that menu and the staging principle that manufactures deniability. Without those two chapters, the proposal addresses an undefined thing, and the first hostile question sinks it. Evidence next, because a legislature will not act on testimony alone. Chapter 5 worked through the Department of Justice's own stalking victimization report of January 2009 and Home Office data to argue that roughly 500,000 Americans may be affected. Be precise about that number. It is an inference from official prevalence data, not a verified count. Chapter 4 then added corroboration from outside the target community. Mechanism last, and this is the step reformers most often skip. You cannot design a durable law without understanding what has defeated every informal attempt at recognition so far. Chapter 6 documented the uniform official reply, repeated across jurisdictions with striking consistency. No such thing exists, go and see a psychiatrist. Chapter 8 cataloged how credible testimony is contaminated by association with unprovable claims until the whole subject turns radioactive and serious investigators keep away. Chapter 9 traced the lineage back to COINTLPRO, establishing that a government has demonstrably run a domestic covert harassment program at scale before. The detail that matters most is how it ended. Not through oversight working as designed, but because ordinary citizens assembled a documentary record that made denial untenable. The knowledge base frames that same wager as three pillars of recognition: law enforcement, legislatures, and the medical and scientific community. That is the architecture. Definition, evidence, mechanism, and only then the ask, every part of it load-bearing. A legislator handed all four is being given a legislative case rather than a moral appeal. But there is a step before any of it, and White knows there is. A statute needs a legislature willing to write one, and that willingness has a precondition. It is not law. It is recognition, and that is where White ends. So the argument arrives in order: definition, then evidence, then mechanism, then the statutory ask. And having built all of that, White does not close on a statute. She closes on something stranger, and in its way more radical than any amendment she proposes. Not a demand at all, but a wager about what would happen if enough ordinary people simply knew what organized stalking is, and could recognize it when they saw it. Eleanor White writes, "If organized stalking were to become sufficiently well known to the general public, it's unlikely this crime could continue." One sentence. It is easy to misread that as soft, awareness-raising sentiment, the kind of thing a book adds after the serious legal arguments are over. It is not. It is a specific claim about what this crime depends on to survive, and the claim is structural rather than sentimental. The dependency she names is secrecy, but not secrecy in the sense of classified files and locked cabinets. The relevant secrecy is unrecognizability. A pattern nobody has been taught to see is functionally invisible even when it happens in daylight on an ordinary street. White's argument is that this invisibility is not incidental to organized stalking. It is the operating condition. Remove it, and several of the crime's protections fail at once. Trace those protections in reverse and the chain becomes visible. Public recognition weakens the deniability built into the tactics. Weakened deniability makes official disbelief harder to sustain. Harder disbelief means complaints survive the front desk. Surviving complaints accumulate into a record. And a record is what a legislator needs before a statutory proposal becomes something they can actually carry into committee. Each link depends on the one before it, and recognition sits at the top. Start with the mental health trap documented in Chapter 6. It works because the account sounds isolated. One person describing something nobody has heard of, to a clinician trained to hear that as a symptom. Now change one variable. Suppose the clinician knows organized stalking is a documented phenomenon with catalog tactics and a historical precedent. The same account stops sounding unique and starts sounding like a case of something known. That is White's prediction, not a measured result. The same reversal applies to the staging principle from Chapter 2. Every tactic is built so that each act, taken alone, reads as coincidence. Car that parks oddly. Cough at the wrong moment. Deniability depends entirely on the observer being untrained. It is a fragile shield. Train enough observers at scale through ordinary public knowledge, and the coincidences stop looking like coincidences. They start looking like what White says they are, a signature. Then institutional denial, which Chapter 6 documents and Section 10.5 names as a legal feature in its own right. It rests on officials being able to say, plausibly, that they have never heard of this. Build a visible body of journalism, scholarship, and legislative attention, and that sentence changes meaning. Ignorance becomes willful ignorance. That is a much harder position for a public official to hold in front of a camera. And then the legislative fix itself, which has a dependency people rarely state out loud. A legislator cannot act on a phenomenon their constituents cannot describe. Bills come from pressure, and pressure comes from voters who can name the thing they want addressed in words a staffer can write down. Public recognition is the machinery that turns private suffering into political demand, and political demand is what turns a drafted proposal into an actual statute. So recognition is not one remedy sitting alongside the others. It is the precondition that makes the others available, which leads to an unglamorous conclusion. In the absence of legal recognition, the most consequential work available is naming the phenomenon, documenting it carefully, circulating that documentation, and persisting. TI1 Voice exists partly for that fourth verb, at one.witisk.org. None of it guarantees anything. It is simply the work that has to happen first. White's benchmark is deliberately modest. She wants organized stalking to become as familiar as workplace mobbing or coercive control already are. Both were once experiences without a name. Sweden's work environment regulator issued rules on victimization at work in 1993. England and Wales made controlling or coercive behavior a criminal offense in the Serious Crime Act of 2015. Neither happened because the harm was new. They happened because it finally had a name. Set the two columns side by side and the gap is easy to state. Stalking, coercive control, and workplace victimization each have a statute or a regulation behind them, a form to fill in, and a line in somebody's statistics. Organized stalking, as of today, has none of those anywhere in the world. No jurisdiction recognizes it as a distinct offense. That is the honest position, and this chapter does not pretend otherwise. The knowledge base holds a study addendum, milestone 0, on official recognition. It argues the same order of operations. Institutions with the power to investigate must first accept that the reported phenomenon is real. It sets out 3 pillars: law enforcement and intelligence authorities, governments and legislatures, and the medical and scientific community. The addendum also attaches projected dates. Those are outputs of a growth model under stated assumptions, not a schedule anyone should rely on. Which brings the chapter to its most practical question, and the one every legislator asks in the first 5 minutes of a meeting. What would this actually do? Recognition is not an abstraction to be admired. If it means anything, it changes specific, nameable features of a target situation. White identifies 5. They are worth going through slowly because they are the answer to that question, and because vague answers are why proposals die in committee. First, a legal name for the harm. Today, a target describing this to an officer A doctor or an employer has no statutory category to point at. They describe it in personal language, which makes it sound like a personal problem. A name that exists in law changes the sentence from something strange is happening to me into I am reporting a recognized category of crime. Until the category exists, you argue for the category before your case. Second, a lower evidentiary wall. As Section 10.2 set out, targets currently face a hidden requirement. Prove the crime exists before any single incident gets investigated. A recognized offense removes that step. For the same reason, a burglary victim is never asked to first establish that burglary is real. The burden shifts from proving a category to showing that your experience fits one. That is a move from impossible to merely difficult. Third, an institutional intake pathway. At present, there is no office anywhere whose job is to receive an organized stalking complaint, open a file, and begin assembling a pattern. Every target navigates a system built for something else. A statutory category is what lets a department write intake protocols, train investigators, run case management, and standardize how evidence is gathered. Ordinary machinery, unglamorous and slow to build, and, for this category of complaint, completely absent today. Fourth, a due process floor. Section 10.1 described the structural void at the center of this. No accuser, no charge, no hearing, no appeal, and yet consequences arrive anyway. A recognized crime carries the opposite architecture. Someone must be accused. Something must be charged. A hearing must happen before any consequence is imposed. Recognition would not stop harassment overnight, and nobody should suggest it would. But punishment without process would lose its legal footing. It is worth pausing on the number that sits underneath all of this. 0. No country, no state, no province currently recognizes organized stalking as a distinct offense. Everything in this section is a description of what recognition would change, not a report on what recognition has changed. And even full statutory recognition would not settle the argument. Recognition is contested, and it would be contested afterwards too, in newsrooms, in clinics, and in courtrooms. Fifth and last, a shift in what the untrained ear hears. The mental health trap works because organized stalking sounds, to someone with no context like paranoia, give the phenomenon a legal name, a documented tactical menu, and a historical precedent, and the same account lands differently. You sound crazy, go and see a psychiatrist loses much of its force when the person is describing something that has a name. That is the claim, not a finding. So 5 concrete changes and one honest caveat under all of them. None has happened yet, anywhere. What White offers instead is a wager that a crime dependent on being unrecognizable cannot survive being recognized. That wager deserves to be stated plainly and then tested against its strongest critics, because a proposal that has not met its objections is not yet a proposal. Those objections come next, answered one by one and honestly. They are describing something named. That is where White's book finally lands, and her closing move is not a demand but a wager. Recognition, she argues, is the most durable remedy available, because it is the only one that no institutional actor can hand out or take back. Everything else in the reform catalog depends on somebody in authority choosing to act. Recognition, once it settles, does not. That asymmetry is the whole argument. Consider what can be undone. A statute can be repealed or quietly left unfunded. An investigation can be closed, shelved, or buried under a caseload. An agency can be captured, redirected, or reorganized out of existence. Each of those remedies lives at the pleasure of people who may change their minds. Public understanding behaves differently. Once a population has learned to recognize a pattern, no committee can vote that knowledge away. White's phrasing is blunt. People cannot unknow what they have learned to recognize, and they cannot unsee the pattern once they have been trained to see it. That is a claim about permanence, not about speed. Recognition spreads slowly and unevenly, and it can be muddied by ridicule. But it does not have an off switch, and that is why she places it above every statutory fix in the chapter. That line comes from an advocacy archive in the knowledge base, not from a court or a criminology journal, and it should be read as a claim rather than a finding. But its factual core is checkable, and it holds. As of today, no jurisdiction anywhere recognizes organized stalking as a distinct criminal offense. There is no statute to charge under, and therefore no conviction rate to argue about. That is the ground the wager is made on. The wager rests on a structural reading of the crime. The secrecy is not the secrecy of classified files. It is the secrecy of unrecognizability. The pattern survives because it is invisible to anyone who has never been taught to look for it. Teach enough people to look, and the invisibility fails. At that point, White suggests, stopping the crime may not require a perfect prosecution. It may require sufficient daylight. Here the honesty has to be flat. The wager is untested. No study has shown that publicity alone can stop a coordinated harassment campaign, and White does not pretend otherwise. She is predicting that recognition could end something that has, on her own evidence, survived decades of silence. That is a strategic hypothesis, not a finding, and nobody reading this should expect awareness by itself to protect them. The claim is about populations, not individuals. But the wager is not invented from nothing. It is modeled on one documented case. In 1971, 8 citizens broke into a small Federal Bureau of Investigation office in Media, Pennsylvania, and mailed what they found to journalists. The Washington Post published that March. A Senate Select Committee then spent a year assembling a public record, and by 1976 that record was too detailed for denial to survive. Notice what did not happen. No agency reformed itself. No court ordered the program shut. It ended because private citizens took the evidence, reporters printed it, and a legislature built a record that could not be argued away. That is the template White is pointing at. It is not hypothetical, and it was not gentle. It has been done once against a real government program in living memory. The wager is that it can be done again. For things made that record irreversible. Documents that existed on paper, journalists willing to print them, a committee with subpoena power, and a year of sustained public attention. Remove anyone and the story dies. It is worth saying plainly that the first of those 4 was a crime, and White's framework does not recommend repeating it. What she takes from media is the sequence, not the burglary. Evidence, publication, hearings, persistence. TI One Voice's own study addendum, published at one.witisk.org, argues the same order of operations. Recognition must come before justice. It sorts recognition into 3 pillars: law enforcement and intelligence authorities, governments and legislative bodies, and the medical and scientific community. The addendum is advocacy research, not peer-reviewed criminology, and its projections are models rather than forecasts. The framing, though, matches White's. Recognition first, then everything that recognition unlocks. A proposal is only as strong as the objections it can survive, so White takes the counterarguments head-on. 5 recur in every legislative discussion, and none of them is stupid. A 6th is not an argument at all but a tactic. The rapid-fire pile of dismissals the knowledge base calls a Gish Gallop, where a dozen objections arrive faster than any of them can be answered. Take them in order. The first objection is the commonest. This is mental illness, and these people need treatment, not a new crime. White's answer is not a denial that some reports have psychiatric explanations. It is an argument about what mental illness cannot produce. Delusion does not generate consistent tactical descriptions among strangers who have never met. It does not leave a footprint in a government victimization survey. It does not corroborate itself from outside. So the chapter points outward, to 4 things that sit outside any individual account. David Lawson's 12 years riding with private surveillance crews. The statistical residue in official victimization surveys. The declassified record of COINTELPRO. And the published physics of microwave hearing, a replicated laboratory effect that Part 11 takes up in detail. None of that proves any particular case. It does mean the phenomenon cannot be filed under psychiatry and closed. Objection 2 says the stalking laws already cover this. They do not, and the reason is arithmetic. Those statutes were drafted around one obsessed pursuer, so they ask whether one person's conduct crosses a threshold. Split the same campaign across 20 people and no individual crosses anything, while the cumulative effect on the target is devastating. That gap is in the statutory language itself, which is why a court cannot simply reinterpret it away. Objection 3 warns of floodgates, false claims, clogged courts, ruined reputations. The safeguards are the ones already holding for every other offense. Proof beyond reasonable doubt, a judge free to dismiss a case that fails at first sight, and prosecutors who are never obliged to charge. Proving coordination needs more evidence than proving one pursuer, so the bar sits higher. Personal incident logs, the knowledge base notes, carry no recognized evidentiary weight today. Objection 4 says the term is too vague to put in a statute. The definitional work, though, is largely done. For elements would carry it. Multiple actors whose conduct adds up to a course of harassment. Coordination shown by pattern rather than by proof of an explicit agreement. A duration threshold, perhaps 6 months or a year, and the same reasonable person test that existing stalking law already uses. These are drafting choices, not mysteries. Legislators have solved exactly this problem before. California enacted the first anti-stalking statute in 1990, after years of arguments that stalking was too vague to define, and within about 3 years every American state had one. That is the honest comparison. The counterweight, equally honest, is that courts are cautious about new categories that are contested or loosely drawn, a pattern the knowledge base traces through American case law. Objection 5. Even if it is real, you cannot prosecute what you cannot attribute. That confuses 2 questions. Whether conduct belongs in the criminal code is separate from whether any given case gets solved. Homicide clearance rates in several large American cities have fallen below 50% in recent years, and sexual assault runs lower still. Nobody proposes removing either from the statute book because the perpetrators are hard to find. Domestic violence, human trafficking, cybercrime, each was once called unprosecutable, and each now produces convictions because investigators learned to build cases inside a category that existed. That is the point of naming a crime. None of the 5 objections is frivolous, and pretending otherwise would weaken the case. Each is answerable on its own terms, and answering them is what turns an argument into a bill somebody is willing to sponsor. Strip away the abstraction and recognition means 3 ordinary things. A report at a front desk that survives triage instead of being closed as a dispute. A prosecutor able to charge one coordinated group rather than 5 unrelated nuisances. A line in the national crime statistics where there is currently nothing. None of that is promised, and none of it is quick. What comes next is the path. Model legislation, pilot jurisdictions, train champions. So the counterarguments are answerable. Every one of them has force, and none of them is fatal. But answering critics is not the same as changing anything. A legislative proposal, however well argued, is not self-executing. Somebody has to write the words, carry them into a chamber, and persuade a majority. White therefore sets out an implementation path, a sequence of achievable steps from where we are now, which is nowhere, to statutory recognition that actually functions. The path has 4 stages, and they are ordered deliberately. First, model legislation, language that exists on paper before any legislator needs it. Second, jurisdictional pilots, meaning a single state or province rather than a national campaign. Third, institutional champions, the police officers, prosecutors, and judges who learn the pattern and build the expertise. Fourth, international coordination, because the conduct described crosses borders. Each stage is slower and harder than the one before it. Step 1 is the least glamorous and the most necessary. Before a legislator can introduce a bill, the language has to exist. A model statute, drafted by lawyers who already know stalking law and criminal procedure, gives advocates in any jurisdiction a template to adapt. Nobody is asking a busy backbencher to invent a new offense from scratch. They are being handed a draft with the definitional work already done and the precedents already cited. White specifies what the model should contain. A definition naming the multi-actor, pattern-based nature of the offense. An explicit extension of existing stalking provisions to group-coordinated conduct. Training requirements for police and prosecutors. Victim service provisions with funding attached. And a data collection mandate requiring agencies to record organized stalking complaints and what happened to them. That last clause is the quiet one, and it may matter most, because it creates the statistical base that every future argument will need. There is a precedent for exactly this kind of spread, and it is recent. Before 1990, no American state had a stalking law. California passed the first one that year, after a series of killings in which the warning signs had been visible and legally unactionable. Within 3 years, every state had followed. Congress added an interstate offense in 1996. A category that did not exist became ordinary law in under a decade. Step 2 follows from that history. Rather than chasing a federal bill first, White suggests starting where legislatures are smaller and advocacy can reach them. A single state, a single province. One jurisdiction that amends its anti-stalking statute to cover group-coordinated conduct becomes a proof of concept. Prosecutors there start building cases. Data starts accumulating. And the next legislature that considers the question is no longer being asked to go first. The model is not theoretical. Neurorights law has spread exactly this way. Chile amended its constitution in 2021 to protect brain activity. Colorado and California each added neural data to their privacy statutes in 2024. In November 2025, UNESCO adopted a recommendation on the ethics of neurotechnology, held in our knowledge base, which is a standard, not a binding treaty. None of them mentions organized stalking, but each of them began in a single jurisdiction. Behind every step of this path sits one precondition. TI1 Voice's own addendum on official recognition puts it plainly. The parent study had assumed the analysis would speak for itself, that once the data showed patterns, prosecution would follow. It does not work that way. Institutions must first accept that the reported phenomenon is real. Recognition is not the reward for justice. It is the gate that stands in front of it. Step 3 is the one advocates most often skip. A statute is only as good as the people who apply it. That means finding champions inside the system. An officer trained to recognize a coordinated pattern, a prosecutor's office willing to build a group case, a judge who understands what pattern evidence requires. None of that arrives with the bill. It has to be cultivated, department by department, over years rather than months. White's phrasing here is worth keeping. Each of those individuals is a proof of concept, and each makes the next one easier. One police department with a trained investigator. One prosecutor's office with a dedicated unit. One judge who has seen the pattern evidence and knows how to weigh it. The infrastructure gets built the way infrastructure always gets built, slowly, unevenly, and by people whose names nobody will remember. It is worth being concrete about what recognition would change, because the abstraction hides the point. The TI1 Voice Declaration names 3 things. Formal recognition by police that the declarant is a crime victim, recognition by clinicians that the reported phenomena warrant investigation, and access to victim services under existing law. In plain terms, a report that survives the front desk, a prosecutor able to charge a group, a line in the crime statistics. The data mandate matters because of what currently substitutes for it. Targets keep their own logs. Our knowledge base is blunt about the limits. Those logs carry no recognized evidentiary value in court, and an audit of the platform's own corpus found many built from identical templates, which weakens the pattern rather than strengthening it. A statutory reporting duty moves the counting out of the victim's notebook and into the state's own records. Step 4 is the most distant. If organized stalking really does cross borders, as targets who have moved countries report, then no domestic statute can reach it. White's endpoint is international, mutual legal assistance treaties that name organized stalking investigations, Interpol channels for sharing information across jurisdictions, and eventually a convention of the kind that already exists for human trafficking and cybercrime. That is a long way off. It is also the logical consequence of the claim. Consider what a single national law can and cannot do. It can define the offense, train the officers, fund the services, and count the cases. It cannot compel a foreign agency to open a file, cannot follow a target's history into another country's records, and cannot reach conduct organized outside its own borders. That gap is why the fourth step exists. Nothing in international law currently fills it, and here the evidence runs out. Which brings the chapter to its conclusion. The due process void that this book has documented, no accuser, no charge, no trial, no appeal, is not a metaphor. It is a structural absence. And the remedy is the one that has closed similar absences before. Name the conduct in law, build the pathways for reporting and investigating it, and create the public awareness that keeps the whole apparatus funded and alive when attention moves elsewhere. There is one line in White's conclusion that deserves to be quoted back at every critic. The framework, she says, is defensible against the charge that it asks for special treatment, because it does not. It asks for the same treatment stalking victims won in the early 1990s, extended to the category those statutes were never written broadly enough to cover. Modest in its mechanics, ambitious only in what it implies. Then White does something unusual. She applies the book's own evidence standard to her own proposal. Is there evidence that extending anti-stalking law to the group form would work? Her honest answer: the evidence is circumstantial but substantial. The 1990s statutes are the precedent. They created a category where none existed, trained investigators in pattern-based work, and gave victims a remedy. The evidence for the fix is the evidence of the fix that already worked. Then comes the harder question, and she does not dodge it. Would a statute actually be enforced by institutions that currently deny the phenomenon exists? A law nobody enforces is a symbolic victory, not a remedy. The American hate crime statutes are the cautionary case. Passed in the 1990s, they took years to produce consistent enforcement, and reporting remains voluntary in many places. Thousands of agencies still report nothing at all. So let us be precise. Today, no jurisdiction anywhere recognizes organized stalking as a distinct criminal offense. Not one state, not one country. TI1 Voice's own recognition index model projects law enforcement recognition around 2029 under its base case, but that is a projection from an internal model, not a forecast anyone should rely on. Statutory passage, if it comes, is a milestone, not a finish line. The implementation fight is just as hard. Name the crime, build the evidence, pursue the law, and persist until the law is real in practice rather than on paper. That is the logic White leaves us with. But it assumes something the chapter has not yet examined: that the officials who would have to act are simply uninformed. The next section asks a more uncomfortable question. What if the people refusing to believe are not cynics but ordinary, decent, and genuinely unable to? Name the crime, build the evidence, pursue the law. Persist until the law is real in practice, not merely on the page. That is where the previous argument left us. But there is an obstacle that no statute reaches, and it is not evidentiary. It is psychological. Before a legislature can act, ordinary people have to be willing to believe that the thing being described could happen at all. That is the harder problem. Section 16 of this chapter names that barrier plainly. The problem is not that the evidence is missing. The problem is that the proposition is disturbing, and the human mind is well equipped to reject disturbing propositions that threaten its foundations. Most people believe they live in a society with working institutions. To accept organized stalking is to accept that those institutions are failing badly, and that acceptance carries a real cost. The chapter puts the cost precisely. If a coordinated harassment network operates with impunity against innocent people, then the institutions a citizen trusts are one of three things: complicit, incompetent, or captive. None of those conclusions is comfortable, and each demands something of the person who reaches it. The default human response to a costly proposition is to reject it, unless the evidence arriving is genuinely overwhelming. Here it is not. The mechanism has a name and a literature behind it. Leon Festinger set out the theory of cognitive dissonance in 1957. The knowledge base entry on him notes that his earlier study, When Prophecy Fails, endures as a case study in how belief systems resist disconfirmation. Dissonance is the discomfort of holding two contradictory ideas at once. People resolve it by changing a belief or by rationalizing the contradiction away. Here is the definition as the knowledge base records it. Cognitive dissonance is an uncomfortable feeling caused by holding two contradictory ideas at the same time. Notice what that implies for someone hearing a target's account for the first time. The contradiction is not between two competing facts. It is between a stranger's testimony and a lifetime of assumptions about how a country treats its citizens. One of those has to give. This produces what the chapter calls a stable equilibrium, and the loop is worth following slowly. The conduct is designed to leave thin evidence. The record that survives is partial and deniable. Outsiders judge it insufficient, so no investigation opens, so no new record is ever created. The evidence stays strong enough to convince those who live it, and never strong enough to move those who do not. The loop holds itself in place. A caution belongs here because the argument cuts both ways. Saying that disbelief is psychologically driven does not, by itself, establish that the underlying claim is true. That reasoning could shelter almost any belief from scrutiny. The knowledge base entry on cognitive dissonance theory concedes as much, noting the same lens is used by those who read the targeted individual phenomenon psychologically rather than conspiratorially. Both readings survive the theory. The theory settles nothing. The chapter's strongest move is historical. Every movement that challenged a settled belief about society met this same wall. Abolition, civil rights, domestic violence, and the recognition of post-traumatic stress disorder as a real injury, which the American Psychiatric Association added to its diagnostic manual in 1980. In each case, the evidence existed before the belief shifted. What changed was never the evidence. What changed was the cost of dismissing it. The legal precedents here are recent enough to be checked. California enacted the first anti-stalking statute in 1990, and the other 49 states followed within a few years. The United States Congress passed the Violence Against Women Act in 1994. Neither law created new evidence about the conduct it addressed. Each created a category, and a category is what allows an officer to write a report that goes somewhere. The chapter is honest about where this leaves organized stalking today. In every earlier case, the shift came when the cost of rejecting the evidence finally exceeded the cost of accepting it. For organized stalking, that point has not been reached, and nothing about the present record suggests it is close. What the chapter proposes is simply the method that history shows working. Accumulate, present consistently, Persist. There is no shortcut on offer. Which brings the chapter to its closing argument, and to the people who have carried this record so far. For decades, targets have documented their experiences in the face of systematic denial. They kept logs that no agency would receive. They assembled evidence that no court would hear. They persisted in the conviction that what was happening to them was real, while nearly every institutional voice they met told them it was not. Thousands of pages of logs, thousands of hours of testimony, thousands of individual acts of evidence preservation, nearly all of them performed alone. The knowledge base describes the practice plainly. Shared documentation techniques, timestamps, patterns recorded in the moment. That raw material is where the organized stalking case begins. It is not, on its own, enough to compel institutional recognition. It is the foundation on which recognition, if it comes, would rest. The movement's own documents are candid about the limits. The guide accompanying the TI One Voice declaration lists what that document does not do. It does not start an investigation. It does not guarantee that anyone will believe you. It does not stop the attacks by itself. The knowledge base is equally blunt elsewhere. Personal event logs currently carry no recognized evidentiary value in court. That is the honest starting position. Eleanor White's framework is what converts scattered testimony into something a legal system can act on. For parts, define the phenomenon precisely. Document it consistently. Extend the statutes that already exist to cover group-coordinated conduct. And build the public awareness that sits upstream of everything else. The chapter does not oversell this. The same framework could be adopted in good faith and still fail if institutional resistance proves strong enough. The reason the chapter still defends it is comparative. This is the framework that has worked for every other category of harm that was once invisible and is now recognized. The due process void, the evidentiary double standard, the group-coordinated structure, the systematic denial. Those are not mysteries awaiting revelation. They are problems awaiting remedy. The framework supplies a remedy. Everything after that, in the chapter's own closing phrase, is persistence. Section 18 sets the due process void beside violations we already understand. Start with wrongful conviction. A person wrongly convicted loses liberty, reputation, and opportunity, but they received a trial, a chance to confront an accuser, and a right of appeal. The system failed them. Crucially, the system existed. They can point to a specific legal error and demand correction. The organized stalking complainant cannot, because no proceeding ever opened. Nothing can be corrected where nothing was begun. The second comparison is detention at Guantanamo Bay, held without charge, without trial, without the right to confront the evidence. That drew sustained criticism precisely because critics could name the rights at stake, habeas corpus and due process, and name the branch of government answerable for them. The organized stalking target occupies a structurally similar position, punishment without process, but can name no responsible institution, because the conduct is deliberately distributed. The third comparison is the closest of the three. Before the domestic violence movement succeeded, victims faced a void of their own. Police logged assault as a domestic dispute. Prosecutors declined to file. Courts had no framework for issuing a protective order against a spouse. The harm was real, the conduct was already criminal, and the institutions failed anyway. That movement won by naming the crime, documenting it, and pursuing legislation. One number should stay in view because it is the honest one. 0. No jurisdiction anywhere currently recognizes organized stalking as a distinct criminal offense. Everything described in this chapter is a proposal, not a settled state of law, and recognition itself remains genuinely contested, including among people who study the phenomenon closely. Nothing here predicts that any particular case would succeed, and nothing here is legal advice. Realistic hope is worth more than a promise. So what would recognition actually change? A complaint that survives the front desk, instead of being filed away as a neighbor dispute. A prosecutor able to charge a group for a pattern, rather than individuals for trivial acts. A line in the national crime statistics where today there is no line at all. The laws largely exist already. Training, categories, and will are what is missing. And a statute still needs a vehicle. The mechanism has worked before. That is the argument we have just made, and it is true. But a mechanism is not a movement. Every reform that succeeded, from domestic violence to workplace harassment to stalking itself, was carried by something the organized stalking community does not yet possess. A statute is a piece of paper. What turns paper into protection is the machinery standing behind it, and that machinery has to be built by people deliberately over years. Section 10.19 names what that machinery is. Advocacy organizations, support networks, research institutions, sustained media coverage. Together they form a civil society infrastructure capable of holding a campaign together across the years, or the decades that recognition may take. The organized stalking movement currently lacks most of it. The organizations that exist are small, under-resourced, and exposed to exactly the discrediting mechanisms this book documented earlier. Building the infrastructure matters as much as drafting the statute. 3 requirements, and none of them is optional. First, institutional voices. Entities with boards, budgets, and professional staff that can meet a legislator, issue a press release, or file a friend of the court brief without being waved away as a front for delusional activism. Second, research partnerships with universities and think tanks. Third, working relationships with the established human rights organizations whose credibility a new cause has no other way to borrow, at least at first. The chapter names 3, the American Civil Liberties Union, Human Rights Watch, and Amnesty International. What such bodies offer is not sympathy but access to legal, legislative, and media networks built over decades. The knowledge base supplies a model of how that is done. The Chwane principles were drafted through the Open Society Justice Initiative by more than 500 experts drawn from over 70 countries. So far, none of those 3 organizations has taken up organized stalking. Look at what does exist. The knowledge base records that targeted individual advocacy groups typically run on donations and crowdfunding, one prominent site sustaining its research through a subscription page. That is a funding model, not an institution. And the community's most common evidentiary tool, the 1000-event memory log, has no recognized evidentiary value in any court. Effort is not the problem here. Structure is. The work is real. The vehicle carrying it is not yet built. This is the pipeline that legislators and journalists actually require. Not louder testimony, but testimony converted into something they can cite. Peer-reviewed work on prevalence, on tactics, on how institutions respond. The knowledge base describes one attempt at the first stage, a scoring model that rates each account for corroboration density, completeness, timing, and cross-referencing on a 0 to 10 scale. TI One Voice runs that structured collection at one.witisk.org. The later stages remain empty. The chapter's judgment is blunt and worth hearing plainly. In the near term, building this infrastructure matters more than any single legislative campaign, because the infrastructure is what makes legislative campaigns winnable. White's framework supplies the content. The organizations, the networks, the relationships, those are the vehicle. The movement today has far more of the first than of the second, and closing that gap is the most urgent strategic priority anyone serious about this cause has. Honesty about limits is itself infrastructure. The knowledge base holds the guide to the TI One Voice Declaration, and it lists plainly what that document does not do. It does not start an investigation. It does not guarantee belief. It does not provide legal representation, and it does not stop anything by itself. What it does is create a dated, structured record. That is a smaller promise and a far more durable one. One more conceptual tool remains, and it is aimed squarely at legislators trained in European legal traditions. The precautionary principle entered European Union law with the Maastricht Treaty, signed in 1992, and has been applied ever since across environmental regulation and public health. Its logic is simple. Where an activity threatens serious harm, protective measures may be taken even though the chain of cause and effect has not been fully established scientifically. The knowledge base gives the canonical wording. When an activity raises threats of harm to human health or the environment, precautionary measures should be taken even if some cause and effect relationships are not fully established scientifically. That formulation, attributed to Hayes, does two things. It refuses to make certainty the price of action, and it shifts the burden so that an activity may be restrained until it is shown to be safe, rather than after harm is proved. Applied here, precaution would say this. The consistency of the testimony, the statistical footprint, the documented historical precedent, and what the chapter calls the acknowledged physics of directed energy effects together justify protective measures, even while the specific questions of who, with what, and through what coordination remain unproven. Recognition, framed this way, is not a verdict on any case. It is an admission that a category of harm exists and needs a route to investigation. The strategic gain is a change of threshold. Criminal proof demands certainty beyond reasonable doubt, a named perpetrator, an established mechanism. Precaution asks only whether, on the balance of available evidence, protection is warranted. That reframing turns recognition from an adjudication of contested claims into an ordinary act of responsible governance, and it borrows a principle many legislatures already accept. Whether any given legislature would agree the threshold is met remains a political question, not a legal one. The counterargument deserves the same airing. The knowledge base notes that precautionary and preemptive reasoning has been criticized for eroding the presumption of innocence, shifting the burden onto individuals to prove they are not a threat. The same entries record that critics of applying precaution to targeted individual claims say a plausible physical mechanism is still missing. Both objections are serious. Neither has been answered, and here the evidence genuinely runs out. Set against all of that, one number holds steady. 0. No jurisdiction anywhere currently recognizes organized stalking as a distinct criminal offense. Not a state, not a nation, not an international body. Every argument in this chapter is an argument for changing that number, and none of it has changed it yet. Anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. The honest position is that recognition is contested, unwon, and still entirely ahead of us. Nearby law is moving, and it is worth being exact about what has actually passed. Chile amended its constitution in 2021 to protect brain activity. Colorado and California both added neural data to their existing consumer privacy statutes in 2024. UNESCO adopted an ethics recommendation on neurotechnology in November 2025, which is not binding on anyone. None of these instruments mentions organized stalking. They are neighbors, not remedies. Strip away the theory and ask what recognition would change on an ordinary Monday morning. A complaint that is logged under a category instead of being filed and forgotten. A prosecutor able to charge a coordinated group rather than 3 unconnected misdemeanors that each look trivial alone. A line in the national crime statistics so prevalence can finally be measured instead of guessed. And training that teaches officers to aggregate incidents rather than judge each one separately. Section 10.21 turns to the audience. Eleanor White addressed her foundational work, in her own words, to the general public and public officials, not to the targeted community alone. That was a strategic choice. She understood that recognition, if it comes at all, arrives from outside, from legislators, journalists, researchers, and a public whose awareness is the upstream condition for every remedy downstream of it. This chapter has tried to honor that choice. The case, restated, is short. Organized stalking exists as a distinct, definable, documentable phenomenon. It affects a meaningful number of people. It is systematically denied by the very institutions that would have to recognize it. And the remedy, extending existing anti-stalking law to its group-coordinated form, is achievable and borrowable. Nothing in that requires believing satellites read minds, or that COINTELPRO never ended. It requires only reading the evidence and applying the reasoning that built the stalking statutes. That leaves one last matter, and it is a matter of words. Throughout, organized stalking has meant what White defined: a substantial number of coordinated stalkers, unknown to the target beforehand, applying a customized menu of tactics. Vagrant drafting, group harassment, coordinated intimidation, multi-perpetrator targeting, risks a statute that either misses the phenomenon entirely or sweeps in conduct no legislator intended to criminalize. The vocabulary built in earlier chapters is the raw material for statutory language. Advocates should insist that any statutory definition tracks the community's own best understanding, because a definition that drifts creates the exact question a statute exists to settle. Does this law cover what happened to me? The chapter's own line is worth repeating. Precision in language is not pedantry. It is protection. The words are worth fighting for, which leaves the hardest objection of all still standing, the demand for extraordinary evidence, and that is where we go next. Precision in the words is worth fighting for. But before a single clause of that statute can be drafted, one objection has to be answered, because it is the objection that greets almost every target at the counter of almost every police station. It is not shouted. It is delivered calmly, often kindly, and it sounds like intellectual rigor. Examined closely, it turns out to be something else. Here is how it works. The objection runs like this. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. The claim that a coordinated harassment network exists, targeting ordinary people, is extraordinary. Therefore, until extraordinary evidence arrives, the rational response is skepticism. Stated that way, it is hard to argue with. It is the principle every careful investigator is trained on, and it protects the public from a great deal of nonsense. The problem is not the principle. The problem is where it lands. Notice what the principle quietly assumes. It assumes that the evidence, if it existed, could reach the person judging it. But the target is asked to supply proof of a pattern, while the institution that would record the pattern declines to open a file. The evidence that would satisfy the standard is precisely the evidence that only an investigation could produce. And no investigation begins because the standard has not yet been met. So watch the loop turn. A target reports a pattern of coordinated harassment. The officer recalls similar complaints, each closed without a finding. The complaint is dismissed. The dismissal is filed, and it becomes part of an institutional history reading. These complaints have been investigated and found to be without merit. The next target arrives, and the record is now heavier. Every dismissal makes the following dismissal easier and slightly more reasonable. The words in that record do enormous work. Investigated. Found to be without merit. They imply inquiry, interviews, evidence weighed and discarded. But in a great many cases, the investigation consisted of nothing more than the dismissal itself. The file records a conclusion that was never reached, only assumed. And because files are what institutions trust, the assumption hardens into something indistinguishable from a finding. That is the record writing itself. That line is not about organized stalking at all. It describes wrongful convictions in the United States, and the knowledge base cites it because the mechanism is familiar. Institutions accumulate confidence in their own past judgments. The Equal Justice Initiative has documented how that confidence held even where racial bias, prosecutorial misconduct, and inadequate defense were plain. Confidence, repeated often enough, stops looking like a habit and starts looking like knowledge. What broke the wrongful conviction loop was not persuasion. It was an external mechanism. DNA testing arrived from outside the courtroom and produced results the system could not argue with. The first American exoneration by DNA came in 1989. The Innocence Project followed in 1992. The lesson is procedural rather than scientific, and it reaches far beyond that field. Self-reinforcing institutional denial almost never corrects itself from within. Something outside the loop has to interrupt it. Which brings us to the shape of the trap. A target must produce evidence convincing enough to persuade an official who has already been trained, by the accumulated dismissals of everyone before them, that no credible evidence of this kind could possibly exist. That is a catch-22 dressed as a standard of proof. The bar is not high. The bar is placed where nobody standing at that counter can reach it. And notice how that official was trained. Not at an academy. Not in any manual. The training is experiential, and it sounds like this. Every time I have heard something like this before, it turned out to be mental illness or a grudge or a misreading of ordinary life. That sentence is not written down anywhere. It does not need to be. It is transmitted by shift, by anecdote, by the shape of the files. This matters enormously for how we talk about it. The officer in that story is not corrupt. He is not part of anything. He is acting in good faith on the pattern his own experience has given him, and by the standards of his job he is behaving reasonably. That is the uncomfortable part of the chapter's argument. The loop needs no conspiracy at all to keep turning. Precedent alone is sufficient. So in what sense is the denial itself evidence? Be careful here because it is easy to overclaim. The uniformity of official denial is not proof that the underlying allegations are true. It is evidence about the filter, not about what lies beneath it. It shows that a complaint of this shape cannot currently get through, whatever its merits. That is a finding about procedure, and procedure is exactly what statutes can change. The knowledge base gives this a name. Doctrine over person describes an institution refusing to investigate a claim, and in doing so denying a person authority over their own experience. Supporters call it epistemic injustice. Critics answer that the comparison is inapt, because the phenomenon being alleged still lacks verifiable evidence of the coordinated programs it describes. That objection is fair, and this series will not pretend otherwise. Both things can be true. There is a documented case of a government reversing the burden of proof onto its own citizens. Australia's automated welfare debt scheme, known publicly as Robodebt, required people to produce paperwork disproving a computer's calculation, rather than requiring the state to prove the debt. The knowledge base notes that the load fell hardest on the people least able to carry it. Single parents, people with disabilities, Indigenous Australians, and anyone short of literacy or internet access. About 470,000 of those debts were wrongly raised and had to be refunded. A royal commission examined the scheme and reported in 2023, finding it unlawful, and finding that warnings had been raised internally and then overridden. Note carefully what the correction actually required. Not a better complainant. A royal commission. The people harmed had been complaining accurately for years, and complaint on its own never moved it. Here is what recognition would actually change in practical terms. Today each incident is judged alone, and alone each incident is trivial, so no file opens and no pattern can ever form. Pattern-sensitive intake reverses the order. Link the reports first, assess the conduct as a group, and only then decide. The tactics do not change. What changes is whether the accumulation of them is ever allowed to become visible. That is the intervention the chapter argues for, and it is deliberately unglamorous. Policy. A training requirement. A statutory category telling an officer that this complaint type is recognized in law and must be assessed for pattern before it is closed. What would follow is concrete. A police report that survives the desk. A prosecutor able to charge a group under existing conspiracy and harassment law. A line in the statistics. The TI One Voice Advocacy Addendum, held in the knowledge base, breaks recognition into 3 pillars: law enforcement, legislatures, and the medical and scientific community. It builds a recognition index and projects dates for each pillar under assumed growth in participation. Treat those dates as exactly what they are. They are outputs of a model, resting on assumptions about numbers that may not hold. They are not forecasts and certainly not promises. Elsewhere, legislatures have shown they can create a category that did not exist before. Chile amended its constitution in 2021 to protect mental integrity and brain activity. Colorado and California amended their privacy statutes in 2024 to treat neural data as sensitive. UNESCO members adopted an ethics recommendation on neurotechnology in 2025, standard-setting rather than binding law. Not one of those instruments names organized stalking, and none was written with it in mind. And here the evidence runs out, so let us be exact about it. The knowledge base states plainly that personal incident logs carry no recognized evidentiary value in court, and that critics see confirmation bias in them. The declaration published at one.witisk.org says as much about itself. It does not start an investigation. It does not guarantee anyone will believe you. It is not legal advice. No jurisdiction anywhere currently recognizes organized stalking as a distinct offense. That is the plain position, and pretending otherwise would waste everybody's time. What this section establishes is narrower and sturdier than a promise. The denial is not an unfortunate side effect of the crime. It is load-bearing, which is why the closing stretch of this episode argues that denial belongs inside the statute itself, alongside the 3 features already set out. So the loop can be broken, but only by something built into the law itself. That brings us to the 4th and last of White's features, and the one she treats as hardest to write into a statute. Systematic denial. Not denial as an attitude, but denial as a procedure. The uniform official reply, documented across Chapter 6, that there is no organized stalking and the target should see a psychiatrist. White calls it the most important. Here is why White puts denial inside the statute rather than leaving it to advocacy. A crime that depends on secrecy to continue is, by definition, a crime whose survival is measured by how well the denial holds. Take the denial away and the crime loses the conditions it needs. Leave it in place, and every other reform sits on top of a reflex that has absorbed every individual complaint before it. White's warning is specific. A law that names organized stalking but leaves the reflexive institutional dismissal untouched will fail in exactly the way that individual complaints already fail. The reflex will simply absorb the new law the way it has absorbed every complaint before it. You would have a statute on the books and the same conversation at the front desk. That is symbolic recognition, and symbolic recognition is what she is trying to avoid. The loop works like this, and notice that nobody in it has to be corrupt. A target reports a pattern. The intake officer hears one trivial incident. The complaint is dismissed and a psychiatric referral is offered. That dismissal joins the record, and the next official, acting in good faith on experience, dismisses a little faster. No conspiracy is required to keep this turning. Only a procedure that never asks whether the incidents connect. So she asks for 3 things in the drafting. Mandatory training requirements so that officers meet the pattern in a classroom before they meet it at a counter. Intake procedures that require pattern-conscious evaluation before a complaint can be dismissed. And a statutory presumption against reflexive psychiatric referral as the first response. None of that diagnoses anyone, and none of it forbids a referral. It changes only the order in which questions get asked. Put the 4 features side by side and you have White's real argument. Group nature, the electronic layer, international networking, and systematic denial. Taken together, they are her case that organized stalking is not a more complicated version of single perpetrator stalking but a categorically different thing. These features are not decoration on the proposed amendment. They are the substance that separates it from a change of vocabulary. That distinction is the whole ask. Let us gather up the whole argument of this episode. It began with a structural accounting rather than a feeling. In any working justice system, a person facing consequence gets four things: an accusation, a chance to confront the accuser, a hearing, and a right of appeal. Organized stalking, as White describes it, supplies none of them. The sequence collapses to selection, followed straight by an open-ended sentence with no mechanism that could ever declare it finished. Second, the evidentiary double standard. No law says organized stalking claims need more proof than a burglary claim, but in practice they do. A burglary victim does not have to demonstrate a multi-year conspiracy to get a broken window taken seriously. A target is asked to prove the pattern before any single incident counts, and the pattern is made of exactly those incidents. So targets become their own investigators, keeping archives nobody trained them to keep. Third, scale. Legislatures do not amend statutes for a few dozen people. White works through the United States Department of Justice Stalking Report of January 2009. 11% of victims reported 5 years or more. 13.1% named 3 or more stalkers. 6.5% could not say. That is 19.6% of cases, and applied to 3.4 million victims a year, about 500,000 people. Fourth, the proposal is not built on empty ground. California passed the first American anti-stalking law in 1990, after a killing that existing law had no way to prevent. Canada added criminal harassment in 1993. Congress followed in 1996. Britain passed the Protection from Harassment Act in 1997, and in 2015 England and Wales created an offence of coercive control. Not one of them names organized stalking. White's ask is deliberately small as a piece of drafting. She is not asking anyone to invent a new field of criminal law. Anti-stalking statutes already evaluate a course of conduct rather than a single act. They were written from the start for behavior that is lawful one instance at a time and terrifying in accumulation. The amendment simply says that a course of conduct can be produced by many hands, not only one. Because Feature B concerns electronic effects, it is worth being exact about what neurorights law has actually done. Chile amended its constitution in 2021 to protect mental integrity and brain activity. Colorado and California each amended consumer privacy law in 2024 to cover neural data. Those are enacted, not proposed. But none of them creates a criminal offense, and none of them mentions organized stalking. They govern data, not harassment. Ask what recognition would change on a Tuesday morning, and the answers get concrete. A police report that survives intake because there is a category to file it under. A prosecutor who can charge a coordinated group instead of shrugging at each individually lawful act. A line in the crime statistics because things that are counted can be studied and funded. And a floor of process where there is currently none at all. And here is the honest ground under all of it. As of this recording, no jurisdiction anywhere recognizes organized stalking as a distinct criminal offense. Not one. Every model we have named addresses something adjacent. Harassment, mobbing, coercive control, neural data. The category White proposes does not exist yet in any statute book on earth. That is the gap this episode has been describing, and describing it accurately matters more than sounding encouraging. Now the things this episode cannot tell you. Whether a statute, if passed, would be enforced by institutions that currently deny the phenomenon. Hate crime laws took years to produce consistent enforcement. Whether the 500,000 estimate survives closer study. It rests on proxies, and the book itself says the direction of error is uncertain. And whether the personal logs targets keep, which the knowledge base notes have no recognized evidentiary value in court, could ever be admitted. White closes on a sentence that is not a promise but a bet. Recognition, she argues, is upstream of everything else. Upstream of the denial, upstream of the deniability, upstream of legislative will. A statute can be repealed. An investigation can be closed. But people cannot easily unknow a pattern they have learned to see. It is an untested wager, and she does not pretend otherwise. It is also the most durable thing on offer. Everything in this episode comes from named sources, and you can check them. The primary text is Eleanor White's Organized Stalking, a target's view, held in the TI1 Voice knowledge base as document 765. The scale figures come from the United States Department of Justice Stalking Victimization Report of January 2009. The statutes named are public law in Britain, Canada, France, Sweden, Chile, and the United States. Read them yourself. If any of this is your life, there is a place to put the record. TI1 Voice is at one.witisk.org, where testimony is gathered, structured, and aggregated, on the premise that accounts dismissed one at a time can carry weight together. Our live stream, TITV, runs at meet.witisk.org. Under Public, TITV. Be clear-eyed. Signing a declaration starts no investigation and is not legal advice. That closes Section 1, the 10 episodes that define the phenomenon. Section 2 turns to the technology, and Part 11 is called the bioelectric weapon, satellite-based mind control systems. It is the hardest terrain in this series, because it is where documented physics, contested claim, and outright disinformation sit closest together. We will apply the same discipline this episode has modeled: what is published and replicated, what is merely asserted, and where the evidence runs out. Thank you for staying with a difficult argument for 2 hours. Nothing here promises you an outcome, a timeline, or a verdict, and anyone who does is selling something. What this chapter offers is smaller and sturdier. The laws largely exist, and what is missing is recognition, training, and the will to add incidents into a pattern. That is a fixable absence. 40 episodes remain. We will keep going carefully, one documented claim at a time.